I will begin his introduction with his signature line, that is, whatever is cognitively legible is translatable. So, what he is trying to say is, whatever mind is capable of reading, that can be deciphered. That means it can be translated. So he has proved what he has said in his translations also. So Professor P.P. Giridhar is among a few class acts in linguistics in India. And he is a practicing translator and a translation theoretician. He has a graduation from RI, Regional Institute of Education, PG in Linguistics and English Literature, and a PhD in Linguistics. A case grammar of Kannada was his PhD dissertation. He was invited for and offered a linguistics PhD at ANU Canberra, Australia in 1986. A thinker and a linguist of sorts and a well-recognized translator of creative fiction, he has shown great flair for literature and translation. He has Englished and published 11 Kannada literary pieces. He has also won a translation grant in 2007-8 from ICWT, University of California, USA. The only Asian to win the award that year. He has published nearly a dozen times abroad in half a dozen countries, in the US, in Japan, in Spain, in Germany, in Canada, in Sweden, and in Singapore, besides in India, on linguistic structure, on literature, on art, and the language of literature, and on translation as a body of ideas and a set of practices. So he ran and edited for several years a translation journal called Translation Today, which is now being brought out by NTM. And he was also head for translation, Center for Translation in NTM, CAL. And he has I would like to mention his translations, which are all translated from Kannada to English. So Gende Timma, it's a very well-known novel by Alnalli Krishna, and Vaisaka, and then one classic, Kannada classic, he has translated, The Inscrutable Mystery, which was originally written by Purna Chandra Tejasvi. The Bounds, that is Haddu by Kamala Narasimha. Life, Breath and the Truth, English translation of Apashuna, the Kannada novel by Kamala Narasimhaya. The Cradle, again English translation, which is being written in Kannada by Mugalli Ganesh. The Priceless, by which is in Kannada, Ashwagandhi, published by Lincoln Europa, Munich, Germany. And he has also translated Beachnalli Krishna's short stories, and he has submitted Sarasamma Strike, an English translation of Shivarama Karanta's Kannada novella Sarasammana Samadhi. And recently he has published a collection of sample of his writings titled On Language, Linguistics, Structure, Linguistic Software, Literature, Folk Literature, ELT, Art Translation and Machine Translation, which is a collection of scientific skeptical essays, which has been published by Lincoln Europa, Germany. So other than that, he has translated many books related to grammar. So among them, one is Mauna Grammar, which is very, even today, which is authored by him, and which is being referred by the students of linguistics. So I welcome you, sir, for this training.
Thank you.
Session.
Thanks very much for the very elaborate introduction. You did not have taken such a long time. Okay. My talk is entitled Interlinguistic Translation, Traversing Some Founding Issues. I haven't quite caught up with translation studies, but maybe I haven't lost out on that, because I figure that I don't quite agree with at least some of what is going on. For example, translation, somebody says translation is of no interest if it is innocent and neutral. Now, this is not quite, I don't quite figure it out, because a discipline has to grow internally. It should not be, it seems to me that it should not be intruded into scholars. I mean, I'm not very sure of what I'm saying, but you see, for example, in a literary piece, you expect the development of the plot story uninterrupted by the writer. It has to be organic. It has to be internally evolved and internally growing. And at least one should not get the impression that there is intrusion by the creator. So in that sense, I mean, in the sense that I hope to have made clear, to say that translation would be of no interest if it is innocent and neutral is like saying that we want to intrude and make it more interesting, which is not quite right, it seems to me. But no, this thought occurred to me only yesterday. But maybe I should develop it. Okay. Now we get going with the talk proper. There are one slide has some advice to my youngsters here, namely that there is something called scientific literacy. It is not this 3R literacy, which may be built, but it is not quite the 3R literacy: reading, writing, arithmetic. It has to do with open, rational, and reasoned thinking, without worrying about my external ambience. That is what scientific literacy is, and I want my younger generation to develop it. See, if you find yourself, if you are independent and not quite bothered about the ambience, you see, man must. It seems to me that man must go by a rationally, intensely, and meaningfully wrought grid of ideas, and not by labels of who has said what and which party is doing what. Man should go by an intensely wrought grid of ideas, and not by labels like BJP, Congress, and names of Chomsky and Einstein, etc. We are interested in a grid of ideas. And that's what scientific literacy is all about. And I would submit to my youngsters here to develop this scientific literacy, which the 3R literacy is important, but that is not enough. We need this kind of literacy to be to surround us, and to develop care and concern to negotiate interhuman space in the right way. And as I said here, this kind of scientific and humanist literacy leads to awareness, which is a constant process of liberation. See, when I hit upon an idea, then I am at the same time enriched and liberated. That you must have felt, either from a book or from a person, from a friend, or in your own mind. If there is an epiphany, or there is a personal paradigm shift because of a new idea, you feel enriched as well as liberated. So if you want to find yourself, learn to think for yourself, think on your own. It behooves man to transgress what reason and common sense set up. So it seems to me that every human endeavor is a building built of the bricks of reason on the foundation of common sense. But instead of concentrating on these, We go by ideas which are prejudiced, etc. Okay. We don't see things as they are, but as we are. Again, our filters are not right. They are not rational, not reasoned. They are prejudiced, etc. Very subjective in a word. So we usually see things not as they are, but as we are. See, through filters which really don't make sense in a rational cosmos. Okay. Now I come to translate my talk proper, which is I'll try to shine some light on natural language per se, because that bears on translation as a phenomenon, because we are talking about interlinguistic translation. We know a lot about natural language now. I mean, we have been knowing it ever since Chomsky came on the scene, but people still don't understand much of what is said. For example, we think that communication is not a defining feature of natural language. Natural language is an expressive tool, and it is not part of the definition of natural language. Communication is only a use to which natural language is put. Which means that supposing there is nobody I'm addressing here, there's nobody which my talk reaches. You cannot say after 1 hour when I speak only to the walls here, you cannot say I have not performed language. That is because I have expressed myself fully. And that is what language does. That language is there for thinking and to create mental worlds, externalize them, and it is not a, there is no, we assume a dialectical unity which makes my speech complete, in dialectical unity in which my speech is complete only when it reaches somebody. That is not, irrespective of whatever happens outside me. Natural language is an expressive tool, much like arts. See, I might write a poem here and nobody may read it, but I have done it. Okay. Now I will shine some light on natural language as we understand it, as it bears on the phenomenon of translation. And then I'll talk about equivalences, which is, equivalence is the foundational idea brick of all translation, no matter who says what. Equivalence is the foundational idea brick in terms of which translation as a phenomenon is built. Now, you can squabble about what equivalence is and how far you can detour from equivalence to do translation. But the core is equivalence. It may be structural, it may be functional, it may be dynamic, or it may be anything else but equivalence. When I translate from language X to language Y, I am moving from the cosmos of language X to language Y in terms of parallels. That's what the translation essentially is. Then we'll talk about translatability, the notion of translatability and non-translatability, which also is vitiated. It is the understanding of which is flawed, because people don't quite have a correct notion of what natural language is. I'll argue later, and you will see that to say dharma is not translatable is not right at all. This is a mindless exaggeration. We'll see why. See, as Winston said, stop me whenever you want, and I'm not here to parade my scholarship. Let's understand things and proceed. That's the only way. That is what human progress is a function of. That our goal is a grid of ideas and not people and labels, and we pursue that. And who says is less important than what is said. Okay, that is about translatability. And then fidelity. What is fidelity? And we talk about fidelity in the original sense, and then somebody has come up with something called abusive fidelity and creative fidelity and stuff. And then we'll, toward the end, we'll talk, say a few words about what literature translation is. I've done some 10, 11 pieces, and I'll articulate some ideas of what have occurred to me in the course of doing that translation. Literature, what is it and what should it be? And in the end, I round off with an excerpt from a translation of mine, which would illustrate a point which I'll elucidate. Okay. Okay, now, as I said, we'll muck out some misperceptions that abound. And once this clearing takes place, you are, as Benson said, you are free to agree or disagree. And as I said, disagreements are absolutely exciting. Then we'll talk about the brass tacks of some specific translation problem in the light of the nature of natural language examples. Examples will produce theoretical genericity. Okay. Now, since translation has to do with natural language, translation must have its roots in the nature of the medium. We're talking about interlinguistic translation. And to say anything sensible about interlinguistic translation, we must know the nature of the medium, because the translation as a phenomenon does have or must have its roots in the nature of the medium in terms of which it takes place. And we'll have the translatability and what is called translatability, both issue from the nature of natural language. Okay, so once we shine light on the nature of natural language, we'll see we'll see that the notions of translatability and untranslatability issue from the nature of natural language. Okay. We think that natural language in its foundations is experience-free. That culture has nothing to do with the genesis of natural language, its structural template, and with my ability to speak that template. Is that clear? Natural language in its foundations is experience-free. We think that natural language has nothing to do with culture in its genesis, in its origin, in its structural template. There is a Procrustean bed, which natural language is, a structural template, a mold, a chase, and my ability, the native speaker's ability to speak that template, my ability has nothing to do with culture. It cannot, it's obvious, right? So we are saying that natural language has nothing to do with culture in its genesis. It is in my genes, and it is in its structural template, in its structure, in the structural Procrustean bed of language, and in my ability to speak that template. This has nothing to do with culture. Okay, now I give an example here. Ing is a suffix, is a sentence, good sentence in English, but the submission here is ing is in fact a free full word. And why is that the case? That is because this is a structural requirement on natural language, namely that all subjects are nouns, have to be perforce nouns. So ing in this example is in fact a suffix elsewhere, but in this sentence, it is a noun and a free noun. So what does this mean? Why is this the case? This is the case because structural requirements on language are cognitive necessities, and cognitive necessities are pan-human, having nothing to do with culture. So phrases like, there's another example of what is pure structure. Black greenhorn. A greenhorn is those who know English know this. Greenhorn is a novice who is a inexperienced kind of person, and greenhorn is a compound. And you can talk about black or Negroish greenhorns, white greenhorns, etc. The whites, etc. And then there are things like that, which are where I have given examples of compounds which are modified outside it from something which apparently is a contradiction, but which in fact, in point of fact, not a contradiction. You can have there is a set of high-rise buildings. You can say this is the lowest high-rise that you have here, where low and high are not in contradiction, because low no longer has anything to do with high, because high is a componential part of a compound called high rise. Or weak strong room. Now in our bank there's a strong room, but it's pretty weak, we can say. Our His Majesty meaning king. Second first night. First night, if it's a compound, then that man has a three first night, or third, he did his third first night or something. And then blue blackbird, white blackboard are not contradiction. They are examples of what is called structure dependence. There are scientific truths about natural language, which of course, as you now see, have nothing to do with culture. And structure dependence is one such scientific truth about natural language. It has nothing to do with culture. Okay. Yeah. Now, but somebody is saying that there is no culture in language. That is nobody's brief. It is in the lexicon that gets into the scene of natural language. So now we come to translation proper from this point. In other words, the structural equivalence between the dative Dravidian Nanage Jwara to me fever is Kannada, Tamil Enekku Juram. See, Nanage Jwara or Tamil Enekku Juram, right, is the dative thing, and its equivalent is a nominative in English. And we are saying that the structural equivalence between I have fever and Enekku Juram is linguistic without being cultural. This is the point. The difference between Enekku Juram and I have fever, they are equivalents, right? There's no argument about that. And if they are considered equivalents, they are structurally equivalent, although they are linguistically different. One, it is you have, there are so many differences. One is that there is a dative NP, and here is in English you have a nominative NP, and there is a full-fledged verb in English. And in Tamil and Kannada, there is no verb at all. So what are we saying? We are saying that the structural diversity here between Enekku and I is not experience driven, is not real world driven, is the argument, which is to say the equivalence perforce goes unquestioned, is not available for discussion in terms of real world experience. You can't argue this difference between Tamil and this structural difference between Tamil and English in terms of real world experience. And you cannot say that the Tamil or Kannada equivalent to English, I have fever, is not an equivalent. One has a dative and the other has a nominative subject. Okay. Yeah. Now we must be right, because culture can't intervene here to change the state of affairs. So I'm reasoning it out. I'm not plucking it from heaven and posting it on you. We must be right in the previous example, because culture can't intervene here to change the state of affairs. I can't change Kannada or Tamil without it has to be dative, and I can't. The native speaker of English can't state the nominative subject of English. So what is the outcome? What is the epiphany here? The epiphany here is that you will see immediately that cross-linguistic equivalency is not sameness of form. This is an important insight. And this is what some people I don't know. Okay, it's not sameness of form is not the target in translation, interlinguistic translation. And we also see that another implication of that example from dative nominative is that it readily rejects literal or word-to-word translation. There is nothing like word-to-word translation. In Kannada, for example, we can say Kelsa Kaditalayalu. She steals work. That means she goes about making excuses, etc., and then it doesn't work. And the exact thing is stealing work, and stealing work does not make sense in English. So there is, in point of fact, the general statement is that there is nothing like word-to-word translation. We'll see why. There is another scientific reason why this is not the case. So people are racking their brains about, no, this is a given for us. For linguists, this is a given. There is nothing like word-to-word translation. Okay. there isn't a much brouhaha or linguistic turn, cultural turn opposition, because with language having to do with non-language, there is no linguistic versus cultural way of dealing with non-language. I wrote a paper which was published in Meta a long back saying that the linguistic cultural turn opposition is flawed, because language is there to create mental worlds of non-language. So when I say I'm going to Chennai, there is a non-language which the sound of the sequence of sounds expresses, and there is conceivably no linguistic versus cultural way of with non-language. Okay. You will also see that some lexical items like ethnography of speaking are arguably more cultural internal than others. For example, mummy, mom, daddy, sweetheart, honey, etc. They are arguably more cultural internal to English than other items. So I don't, in my English translations of Kannada literary pieces, I don't use mummy, daddy, etc. because we think it's more cultural internal than father and mother. Okay. 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 Now there's another example which is a persuasive example, and that is that I went to the doctor is sentence in English, and in Tamil it is not went to the doctor. It is doctor. It is near the doctor. In Kannada and Dravidian that is the case. Doctor kitta pone. But in English it is to. And in Kannada and in Dravidian languages, Tamil, etc., it is kitta. Now, there is no real world experience, and somebody called Spencer argued that in Kannada, we go only to the vicinity of the doctor. I mean, that's a very lame thing. And as if in the English sentence where you say to, you go into the doctor. You don't go into the doctor, right? You also go into his vicinity, just as you do in Kannada and Tamil and other Dravidian languages. And we know the story about the train Cats and Dogs, or the Hindi Humne Uski Khoob Dhulai Ki, which means we bashed him up. Dhulai literally means wash or make something wash, etc. Not just phrasal verbs like do in, do away with, do up, idiom, etc. But language generally does not operate on a word-to-word basis. The equivalence is not mathematically fixed, which is why a bad translation does not yield the same product. Seagull, somebody translated as Jalkawa in some meetings, and then but Jalkawa may not. We see, supposing you want to translate back Jalkawa into seagull, you may not get seagull. You will get only water crow or something. Now, as we said, the equivalence is the foundational idea brick in terms of which all translation is done. And people might write treatises what equivalence is and how my translation is deviates from equivalence, etc. But the point, the fact that they have to talk about departure from equivalence, etc. The equivalence is important in that sense. It is foundation. It is a foundational idea brick of the building of translation. It is a paralleling sameness of content that is central to all translation, conceptual or human cognition driven. That the allegedly unique cultural cognition is pretty much integral to human cognition is the idea. And I don't know whether I'm right. I'm open to correction. There has been an ad nauseum accent on culture in translation studies. You see, this is the discussion dharma. People have argued that dharma and other words are not translatable, which I deeply disagree with. The following is an exposition disagreement, and you should mull it. Okay. Nobody knows why ethical template, for example, is not its English translation. And its other meanings are obligatory moral duty, righteousness, natural property, lawfully wedded religion, and so on, which are arrived by if let's say dharma has 50 meanings, 50 senses, or this is again nothing spectacular for a linguist. Languages have words, lexical items with 10 senses, 20 sentences, 50 senses, 60 meaning. That is not new to us at all. But you can figure out, sort out the senses by capturing the selectional affinities that hold or obtain between or among constituents in the sentence in which the word dharma occurs. We don't see any problem at all. There is no mystery or esoteric. Dharma Patni in Kannada, for example, I have said there is no mystery or esoteric arcaneness about any language. Okay. Dharma Patni is lawfully wedded wife. This is Kannada. This is Kannada. Dharma Patni is lawfully wedded wife. There is no problem. Dharma Chatra is an abode for charitable purposes. There is no problem. Idu nanna dharma means this is my morally obligatory duty. There is no problem. Melinda Kalakke hariyudu neerine dharma. Flowing from a higher level to a lower level is water's dharma, which in this sentence it is natural property, of the being of water. And you see here, dharma in an application form means religion and nothing else. People have argued that dharma does not mean religion, and very fashionably argued that dharma is not religion. But the question to ask them is, what is it in an application form? In an application form, dharma means just religion, no more and no less. Itu manava dharma. This is man's ethical template. Okay, the people again, and so this is vantage point. They say dharma has a prototypical meaning which is not translatable, which is doesn't make sense to me. Okay. Yeah. Okay, let's say I have given some exotic words. Some of you might know these words, some of you might not. But nyctophobia means that fear of nightly darkness, it seems. Nubnik is a nagging bore, a human pest, somebody who is with you and nags you often and annoys you. Skulking around is to keep out of sight with a sinister or cowardly motive. And recently, the word wax was declared the word of in Oxford University, Oxford OUP, Oxford Dictionary. And the sentence in this, I remember the sentence in the newspapers which said, wax, which has been skulking around for a while, now has got it. That is, has been keeping out of sight, but is now is in the limelight. He has got the spotlight. Now, can you say nyctophobia, nubnik, and skulk around are non-relatables? Is that logical? They are, we call them lexical gaps, and lexical gaps don't imply untranslatability, is a submission. That lexical gaps don't imply untranslatability is a submission. Okay. Now we said that there is no direct word-to-word translation. I went home and gay ho, that Tamil has gay, the dative, relative or the goal thing. But in English, I went home, there's no to there. Now, there is no word-to-word translation because language operates in terms of categories which are universal. So when you translate, you express those categories and not word which express that category in that language. So we have categories like nominal categories, embedding, recursion, and so on, which have nothing to culture, and the expression of these categories, these culture-free categories in English, could be different from how it is expressed in Tamil, Icelandic, or Japanese. So you don't translate the text in English into its exact word-to-word equivalent in Japanese. What you do is to see what that word expresses in terms of grammar, what kind of tense aspect is, etc., and then see how Japanese expresses that category. Japanese as a culture or whatever expresses that culture-free category, which is true of all languages. So I went to the doctor, I went near the doctor, he said that the relationship between, this is called case. In one case, this is case, which is universal and culture free. It has to, every language has to have it. And in English, this particular goal of the goal is expressed by 2, but in Tamil it is kitta. So we don't say, they translate 2 and keep 2 here. What you do, you translate the category called case and see how that category is expressed in Tamil, and then you do that. In Tamil, it's expressed by kita. In English, it's expressed by 2. So you don't say 2 and the exact equivalent of 2 here. Okay, Dr. Kitta Poonan, etc. Then I'm going to go home the day after. Then in Kannada, it is Nanu Nadiddu Manege Hogtini. It is the 9 words in English and 4 words in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4 words in Tamil as well. Nana Nalanakku Vittukku Pome. It is, so you see that it's not it's askew. The correspondence is askew and it is not one-to-one, one-on-one. Okay, so now we have talked so far about structural equivalence. I went to the doctor is structurally equivalent to Dr. Kitta Poonan, or this is a book is structurally equivalent to kitab, or in Kannada we say idu pustaka. There is no article and there is no verb in Kannada, but they are structurally equivalent. Structurally equivalent. Now, sometimes structural equivalence may not be enough, especially in literary translation. There is a sentence which goes as follows. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven and derided by vanity. Gazing up into the darkness, I saw myself as a creature driven, derided by vanity. The sentence in the Joycean short story called Araby. Now let's see what this sentence is about. Yeah. Okay. Now there was a brilliant analysis of the sentence, which was published in a journal called Literary Semantics by a man called David Hirsch. And he argues that one of the meanings, literary meanings, not the linguistic meaning of the sentence, is that of the protagonist being sandwiched between the external world above the sky and his interior. He is gazing up into the darkness of the sky, but he is goaded, forced into look inward, forced into looking inward. And then an epiphany happens, an enlightenment happens, a personal paradigm shift happens. And then he discovers himself. So the point here is that this sandwiching between his physical action of looking at the darkness of the sky and he's being goaded to look inward is, David Hirsch argued, is iconically captured in English. Why? Because gazing up into the darkness, which is a subordinate phrase, it is not a subordinate clause. Subordinate clauses have to have finite verbs. In this case, there is no finite verb. So there is a subordinate phrase beginning the sentence, setting the sentence going, and there is a subordinate phrase as a creature driven and derided by vanity, which winds up the sentence. And in between, sandwiched between these two subordinate phrases, is the independent main clause, which is I saw myself. And in Tamil, Winston Kame, Iruluk, etc., Nan Ennai Kandane. Nan Ennai Kandane occurs at the end. In almost all Indian languages except Kashmiri, I guess, it occurs in the end. So that the literary meaning of the protagonist being caught between his physical of looking upward and his mental paradigm shift is captured very well in English, because he is like the protagonist. A sentence also is sandwiched between two subordinate clauses in English, but not in Tamil. So although this is a structurally equivalent sentence to the English sentence. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that structural equivalence, and I wrote a paper called Structural Equivalence in Literary Translation, which was published in Language and Style, where I took and then argued that the structural equivalence may not be may not be enough to capture literary meanings, as we saw in this example. Okay. If there's any question, stop me. I've come halfway through. If there are any questions, stop me. And I'm not here, as I said, to parade whatever I happen to know. Now, I take the position that whatever is expressed in a natural language is subject to expression, subject necessary to be articulated in natural language B. This is not strictly fully true, but it seems to me that we need to speak out with this assumption because of two reasons. Because of two reasons. One is that all humans are pre-wired identically. They're programmed identically. And anything that you can conceive in one language, you should be able to conceive. You cannot say, I can't conceive something like Bharatanatyam. I can't conceive something like Weltanschauung. I can something like, even if I don't have a ship in my culture. So I am saying that that is not acceptable. You cannot say, this is a word in Sanskrit. You won't understand it. That is not acceptable. Why? Because the word, the cognitive material that the word encapsulates, I have. Although my language does not express it in one word. So what are we in effect saying? We are saying that all cultures are subsets of a bigger human set. But the formal Vevidal in the language Y may be different. Okay. Yeah. So there are two reasons why I said what I did, namely that we humans are the same cognitively and biologically. All human suffering has the same source. Humanity is the same at the level of the body, soul, and the spirit, with the necessary result that the pre-linguistic, pre-existing cognitive material that linguistic meanings are forged from is shared without exception across human groups. You take any word from any language, it may be Icelandic or Latin or Japanese or Angami or Santali or Bengali or Tamil, the meaning that it has is quarried, is chiseled out from the same cognitive rock that all humans share. I hope you get that. No matter what the word is, no matter what the language is, the cognitive material that the particular word packs in itself, every other human has. But my language does not treat it linguistically the same as Sanskrit or English. But you cannot say that I cannot understand per se, I cannot understand Weltanschauung, I cannot understand Dharma, I cannot understand Abhisheka, I cannot understand Havana, I cannot understand whatever. Why? Because Sanskrit speakers or Japanese speakers or English speakers, Latin speakers, they're all human beings. And there is a foundational rock that we all share. And the cognitive rock from which the meaning that is packed in a word in English, every human has. There's a question? Okay. Now, I said there are two reasons. The second reason is that if there is a word, there are two things. One is
so there's a question.
There is a sound sequence.
So there's a question.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
But the word has to be understood within the context of utterance. That's Dr. Annie Kuriachan. The word has to be understood within the context of utterance. If the context is not understood, how do we understand the word?
No, this is the problem. This is the problem in both literature and I think in translation these days. But when we talk about language, we talk about concrete instances. If you can give me a concrete instance, that I can deal with it. So is that the question that in a sentence or in a suprasentential context, this is it, and what is the I don't know. Okay, I'll finish it. Now I said there are two reasons why we need to say that anything that is expressed in one language is necessarily subject to expression in another language. Now, this is not an absolute statement, but what I'm saying is that we need to strike out with this position, because of this is prompted by two reasons. One is that we are all cognitively, biologically same. The second is equally important, and that is that I have a word in language X, and that is there are two things. It is dyadic in that it is a sound sequence to begin with. It is a sound sequence to begin with. There is a universe of sound to which the sound sequence belongs. And corresponding to that, the culture has seen that corresponding to that, there is a meaning attached to it, a cognitive material attached to it, which is in the cosmos of this different cosmos. The universe of sounds is one, and the universe of cognition is another. What man has done is to bring these two together to make one word. They are from different directions, different and unrelated directions. That's what we'll see now. And since that is the case, we can disengage them, the sound sequence, from what it means, and then re-engage them in another language. Although re-engagement is problematic. But you see, roughly, this is the theoretical position it seems to me that one should take. Then there is then what is a word? What exactly is the word in natural language? In natural language, the word is a symbol. If I do this is not a symbol. The inward wave, the inward wave of my hand is imitates what it means. So we call it an icon. So the meaning is imitative of and issues from the gesture. When I do this is called an icon. It is imitative of the meaning, that is coming toward the movement toward the speaker, and it issues from that. So it is not arbitrary. It is imitative of and issues from its meaning of movement toward the speaker. So we say the signifier and the signified are in that relationship. So that in when the relationship between the signifier and signified is one of imitation and issuing, we call it an icon. And there is another. There are three kinds of signs. So when this is nothing special about this, but this is the known thing: icon, index, and symbol. If you have smoke from fire, you have the fire issuing from smoke issuing from fire, but not imitative of fire. The smoke does not imitate fire, so we call it index. And there is a third kind of sign which is neither imitative nor issuing from the signified. If you have a word like dog, da or ga, that is a sound sequence. It is in the universe of sounds, and the English speakers have given this sound sequence the cognitive material chunk of an animal of some description. Okay. Now you will see that the meaning, the cognitive material that is attached to the sound sequence dog, but it's still not a word. It's the sound sequence dog. Is neither imitative nor issues from the sound sequence. I hope that is clear. That the sound sequence dog does not imitate the meaning of the animal, nor does it issue from that object, the meaning. So is the question with God. God, God is the sound sequence, and the native speakers of English have attached some kind of cognitive chunk as meaning to this sound sequence, and they have brought them together. There is no reason why dog and God should mean the cognitive material that speakers of English have put into them. That is clear if you say, for example, DDO, the same sounds. DOG has the same sound, and God also has the same. The sequence is different, but sequencing is different, but the symbol, the sounds are the same. But here, GDO, for example, the sounds are the same, and the sequence is different. but it is not a symbol. Why? Because there is no cognitive material that is packed into this sequence. So this is not a symbol, this is nonsense, and this is not a linguistic object, or this is not a word or a linguistic object in that language, in English. So dog and God are symbols, but GD word dog is not, graw is not. Graw is not a word. Why? Because the sound sequence is not given a correlated cognitive material, piece of cognitive material. So this is not a word in that language. It is nonsense. It is not a linguistic object. So you dustbin it. It doesn't make sense to a native speaker. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So while being real, a total of the Vevedal is the exception rather than the norm. We saw the example of the word dharma, that this word can't be conceived and verbalized in other languages does not make good sense. I am submitting that this word can't be conceived and verbalized in other languages does not make good sense. I am submitting again that what any human can do, any other human can do. Then we have to see why he cannot do. If somebody can do Bharatanatyam, somebody else, a girl in another culture can do, why not? Anything that is intelligible, anything that is cognitively legible is subject to translation. Yes, that's what, that was a part of the introduction that Jnana did for me. This is my position. Anything that is intelligible, anything that is cognitively legible is subject to translation. With exceptions, we'll see. But we need to strike out with this position for the two reasons that I elucidated. So then the question then is dharma cognitively legible? Cognitively legible means what? Is it intelligible? If it is, we are into what it means, and the translation is pretty much on the cards. If the word sound sequence dharma is cognitively legible, if it is intelligible to anybody on the planet, a translation is pretty much on the cards. And if the translation is not on the cards, it is not a word in any natural language. It is a submission. Okay. Yeah. Okay, now what is translation? As I said, translation, as I said, is basically is a foundationally equivalence. We are not talking about adaptation here. We are talking about, we are charging the word translation with some technical sense. So there is some technical charge to the word translation. And we are not talking of adaptation, translation and stuff. People confuse things and they all collate them into one big basket, which is not right. I have seen this happen in translation studies, which is not right. We need to be scientifically credible discipline. We need to have rigor, robustness. That I don't know whether it's too much to say that, but it has been missing in translation studies, and people have written about. I have written about it, and people have quoted me, but I don't know how many people. But there are problems there, prejudices, etc. Okay, the translator looks for parallels in the cosmos of the target language in terms of structural, functional, and dynamic. We've seen what structural equivalence is. Now, this is an example of a function of what is called functional equivalence. Shall I compare you to a summer's day, for example, Shakespearean? It will have to be, shall I compare you to you, spring day or something, if summer is unpleasant in this part of the world. So this is functional equivalence. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry is the English locution. You can have every Uma, Umesh, and Ramesh, etc. In different languages, you can have their functional equivalence. And that should be done. Why should Tom, Dick, and Harry continue in Kannada or Tamil? Okay, dynamic equivalence, which Naida talked about long back, is this means targeting the content somehow, if not by a single word or by a linguistic stretch or even an anecdote, so that the content is captured. Okay. We now come to answer. Okay, by saying that, by saying and elucidating the reasons that I did for saying that everything that is expressed in language X is necessarily subject to expression in language Y, because of the reasons I put forth. I'm not saying, and no one is saying that there are things which are problematic, which don't translate properly, or there are what could be called untranslatables, and we'll see what they are. And then, but not dharma, not the word dharma, but there are other things which could be considered untranslatables or untransferables in a sense. Number one is, so you can list those things. You can list things which are except the rule that I laid out, namely that whatever is expressed, articulated, externalized in language is necessarily subject to expression in language Y. Now, we are now talking about the exceptions here, and talking about under the rubric of untranslatability. Number one is rhyming and alliteration is not untranslatable, but it is untransferable. Because rhyming and alliteration don't contribute to linguistic meaning. They contribute to some effect, and that effect is not transferable. You cannot say it is not translatable. Then again, you see, we are now seeking some precision. So we say rhyming, alliteration, rhythm, blah, 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 so that a sound contrived effect contrived by feedback from sounds is not transferable. You cannot say it is not translatable. That is wrong. The other day I saw the song, and there are so many examples. This is commonplace. Dil mein jagi preeti ki jwala jab se main hosh sambhala. This is a lovely part of a lovely lyric in Hindi, Jwala and Sambhala. In English, you may not get this, or in Tamil, you may not get this Jwala Sambhala effect. So what do we say? We say that it is translatable, but the effect contrived by sounds, rhyming, alliteration, rhythm, etc., is not transferable. Then this could happen with resonant repetition. If you want tea badly, you will get bad tea here. உனக்கு எப்படியாவது டீ வேணுமென்னா இங்க மோசமான டீ தான் கிடைக்கும். So there is a resonance between badly and tea badly and the adverb badly and the adjective bad in English. That is lost in Tamil, but you cannot say this is not translatable, right? You cannot say this is not a translation of the English sentence because of alliteration and rhyming, etc. Can you? So all we can say is that the effect is not transferred. Or when we say wars break out and relationships break down when language break up. Wars break out and relationships break up when languages break down. Out, up, and down. This is nice in English, but this may not be transferred to Japanese, into Tamil. It is not, I guess. Into Kannada, because the breaking out, breaking up, and break down. Wars break out and relationships break when languages break down. Wars break out and relationships break up when languages break down. So break up, break out, break up, and break down. The effect made for by the parts of the phrasal verbs here is not transferred, is not transferable. Okay, yeah. Then some more dil chura ke aankh na chura. So chura churana happens to be possible in Hindi. You have stolen my heart. Now we don't steal eyes, but in English we don't steal eyes. Nor do Tamil steal eyes, I guess. So after stealing the heart, don't steal the eye. I don't know whether Tamil that is possible. I don't know whether that is possible or not. You have to tell me. Okay. Yeah, same thing. And there are so many examples like this. My brain has two parts. There is nothing right about the right part, and as for the left, there is nothing left. The play of resonance between right and right, there is nothing right about the right part. They are different. They are phonically the same, phonetically the same, or phonologically the same, but they are different linguistic objects. There is nothing right, meaning nothing correct about the right part, right as opposed to left. And as for the left, that is left as opposed to right, there's nothing left, which is a past participle of the verb leave. English happens to have some resonance between these, but languages may not. So you cannot say it is not translatable, but it's surely the effect is not transferable. In, I don't know whether it's okay. You can read the Tamil sentence. And languages have, okay, yeah. Languages have inherent expressive color. You see, there is no denying this. I'm not, by saying what I did, taking the radical position I did in the beginning, I am not denying so many things which are there for all to see. There is inherent expressive color in language. It is lovely and very picturesque expressions, locutions. Mere rang mein rangne wali. I don't know how, it's very colorful in Hindi. Head over heels in love. It's very colorful in English. Go to the dogs, very colorful in English. If you're on fire, you can put the world on fire. It's very colorful in English. But the same effect, same thing doesn't carry over to other languages. But you cannot say that it is untranslatable. The effect is gone. Maybe the effect of beauty and elegance and symmetry is gone. And I confess that maybe Mere Rang Mein Rangne Wali, the Tamil translation may not be as picturesque, as colorful, as beautiful, as symmetrical, as mind-touching as the Hindi thing. That is admitted. But you cannot say it is not translatable, because whatever this does, Mere Rang Mein Rangne Wali, the cognitive material that underlies this, that underwrites this, I know anybody on any language on the planet would know what it means, and he is not in control of that, because his language has a different wherewithal of expression. His language is a different expressive tool. Okay. Then interrogative ordinal. Somebody asked Nan Estevanalappa, what is my rank in the line of Viga Kudus? And then he is saying, you're not even the first one. You see, here, Estevanalappa, what is my rank in the line of demon you have wooed? This is a huge thing. But in Kannada, it is Estane. This is technically it's called interrogative ordinal. Here it's in the no man's land. I think you can. I'm not. It is still translatable in a sense, but it's not nowhere near the economy or beauty of the Kannada or Tamil thing. Okay, I am bereaved. Now, I am bereaved means someone. Now we don't know how to elucidate that, the relationship between someone and the dyer. But someone has died, close to me or whatever. I don't know if a friend of mine dies. Can we say I am bereaved? But if my wife dies, I can say I am bereaved, or my brother dies, I can say I am bereaved. Our PM dies, because I don't know whether we can say we can say we bereaved, I guess. But the point is that when I say English lexicalizes cognitive chunk, which is in different places in other languages. For example, in Kannada, there is no direct one-to-one translation. I have to say someone close to me or whatever, related to me, etc., died, full stop. Which immediately has departed from this. In I am bereaved, I am the subject. But in Kannada or presumably in Tamil, someone close to me died, so someone would be the subject. I don't know Kannada, but Tamil has the equivalent of bereaved. Okay. Aap ban gayi, tum ban gayi tu. This is a famous part of the couplet, Urdu couplet. Aap ban gayi tum ban gayi tu. The progression of intimacy. This is possible because of the structure of Urdu or Hindi. Aap is you, honorific, which could also be intimate. You can address your wife as Aap, which is also intimate. But Aap is here in this case honorific. Ban gayi tum, which is another second person pronoun in Hindi, and then tum ban gayi tu. Imagine doing it in English. English has only, you might use thou, but in modern English there's no thou. But you have to say you or U1, U2, U3 or whatever, which is obviously not elegant. Okay. Novel into English, the courier says, Auru Rajanna. He leaves it unsaid. That means they, the king, direct object, and what happened to the king is left unsaid. And that is possible because in English, in Kannada, verbs end the sentence. So this is the subject and the DO, direct object, and the word is left unsaid by the courier. And the queen's encore is, Auru Rajanna, she encore, what did they do to that? They kill him or what? Now the translation is very odd here. The translation in English, the king ends the sentence. The verb must come here, which the courier has left unsaid. They dash the king. The translation, that is the translation, but it's very odd. The courier leaves what happened to the king unsaid, which is felicitous in Kannada because verbs end sentence in Kannada. But in English, this leaving unsaid, a fill-in school exercise is problematic. Okay. I don't quite remember what I did, but this is problematic. The texts are, there is a notion called self-identical. So we say that maybe human beings are also not self-identical, and the source texts are not self-identical, means they are layered up. They don't have a fixed singularity ID, which is why back translations don't end up identically. They have many IDs, many identities. Source text has many identities, many layers of this echo texture, which is why translate X as Y in language, whatever. Then the Y is the translation of X. But if you ask somebody to back translate Y into X, then the earlier X may not be the X that somebody translates Y into. That is because texts are not self-identical. They have many identities. Language itself is like that. So much like the donor can have a range of good translations, so do back translations of translated text into source languages, which is a fascinating aspect of translation. This happens much less often in discursive translation. Okay. Okay. This is also important, and I would like serious students of translation to mull this. I am not sure of the practice of translating text in the service of power, of ideology, and personal agendas. Like a legal validity is a yardstick for translations done of a type of discursive discourse. I would argue for a rigorous, creatively expansive template validity for literary translations. That is missing, I guess, but I don't know. I need to be fed more things, maybe. So what I'm saying is your freedom to do something with the source text is not unbridled. It cannot be unbridled. That has tended to be the fashion, at least until recently. But I don't know now what is happening now. It can't be a free for all. Much like literature per se is in need of some such reiner. I argued in a paper I published in Singapore that a paper titled "Art Cannot Own What Reason Disowns." I argued that the creative writer can't do anything that he wants. For example, I took the example of Samskara, the much hyped and much ballyhooed literary piece. I argued that it dignifies, validates, legitimizes, lionizes this horror called caste. And so it does not qualify to be called literature. It's a very radical thing, but you should have a look at it and then feed me back if you want. Yeah. Translation, like all art, is a life-giving, life-sourcing, life-affirming, life-enhancing, being-deepening, ethically salubrious, and civilizationally salutary activity. It has to be. All translation, like all art, must meet this deductive essentialist condition, it seems to me. Art for art's sake is a huge myth. Art is for life and civilization. Under the guise of art for art's sake, you can't do anything. A painting has to make sense. A sculpture has to make sense. Music has to make sense. There can be noise. And so is the case with literature. That hasn't happened quite in literature, but that is the case. That has been the case, but what to do? That is the way. Okay. I summarily reject all literature and all translation which is otherwise. They can't light up the reader's paths because they are not lit themselves. They burn down rather than light up interhuman space. Okay, yeah. This is also a fact which we should reckon with. Bilinguals are often not happy with the best versions of literary texts. This possibly well-founded dissatisfaction is not very relevant discursive translation. This has to do. And that's maybe very legitimate. We don't know. So, but this is the meaning of the quickly impressive idea that the greatness of all great poetry is locked up in the original. People have said that, very distinguished literators have said that the greatness of all great poetry is locked up in the original. That the meaning that escapes the code is no longer the same meaning. This also has to be researched, I think, which to me is too strong, but I'm not off the cuff rejecting it. Okay. Yeah. This is just a general word of advice for literary translators. Read the text closely, grasping its ins and outs, taking the paragraph as a unit. You see that the soul, the texture is captured in the best way possible in the target language. We saw that linguistic equity is not sameness of form. Keep the underlying content in mind always. Let that decide the form in the target language. Form in the source language, which is underwritten by some content which you arrive at. And then you go to whether you go from this content straight to form, or you go from content to the content which is what unique, not unique, but which is its own sort of TL, and then go to form. So there is an argument about whether you got for SL to go to content, there's SL content, and then not go to form directly, but to another kind of content which this form is underwritten by, and then go to TL form. Where there are no single word translations, you can the meaning, etc. Yeah. And what I did was, okay, next slide. What I did was that when you can't unpack the meaning of a particular word in terms of when there's no lexicalization, then what you can do is you can unpack the meaning as part of the text, and then say, then transliterate and italicize the source language word. You can just, so I follow the ethical template. That is the thinking of what this means, and then say the dharma, so that you make the reader walk halfway to the source language. We were into a period of condoling when normal activities are suspended. That is the meaning of sutaka, we say in Kannada, and that doesn't have a single word equivalent in English. So what I did was, we were into a period of condoling or mourning when normal activities are suspended, comma, the sutaka, and so that the English native speaker knows what sutaka means, so that we are unpacking as part of the text, not footnoting it. And this is I think this I have done it very often, and this should become standard practice. We did some ritual bathing, the Abhisheka. Abhisheka means nothing more, nothing less than ritual bathing. And if people say, no, it doesn't mean, then they have to tell me what it means. They can't say, no, Abhisheka is very nebulous and there is no translation. That you cannot say. No? You can't say in a science. And Sex Peddling Street, the Chandra Bidi, in a poem I translated recently, which is being launched in Bangalore on the 24th. Chandra Bidi, where Chandra is moon. So when the moon shines, it is night. So sex is an activity which happens in the night. So Sex Peddling Street, the Chandra Bidi. Kannada festive New Year Day, the Yugadi. Remember that there is no mysterious or non-unpackable linguistic object, and that literary translator is more than a technician or a mere transmitter of info, as literary language is resonant with values and intensities beyond those of bare infos. Yeah. This is important again. This is again for literary translators, serious literary translators. All literary translation is a seamless combo of a native sensibility, a local thought movement, feeling at home or finding a home in an alien code. All literary translation is essentially a native sensibility finding home in an alien code. That is, an English translation of an Indian language text must sound like readably idiomatic English, but one should at the same time feel or be made to feel a regional source language sensibility peeking out of it. So people, literary translations may be flawed on either of these fronts. Either that it doesn't sound like English, or it sounds like very facile, eloquent, and convent kind of English. It does not make sense. There should also there be a creative pushing of boundaries of English expression, so that the regional source language sensibility makes its presence felt. So either on either of these fronts, translation can fail. Okay, this is an excerpt from a novel I wrote, the translation of a novel called Avishaka, which was published in 2000. There are two styles in that language. One is the formal kind, textbookish Brahmin kind of Kannada dialect. The other is the rural, colloquial and spoken by the Dalits and others. And this is supposed to be an illustration of the other kind. Ayayo, I tripped up and nearly fell. This dog is all over the place, holding me back at every step. May hell take its line. Irritated, Lakka handed the dog a full-blooded kick. The canine fell aside, yelping, then rolling over, trotted off. Lakka, who was coming from the respectable Krishna Shastri's house, spotted village urchins play a game of riddles on the mud house platform raised around a Devaganagale tree. He stopped by to watch the game. Now, a theoretical question is, okay, a five-faced horse whirls around on its heel. What is it, posed the boy. This set the kids thinking, but nobody could come up with an answer. Chumps, you didn't get even that? The churn stick, damn it. The darky bellows in a dark room. It was a little girl who presented the teaser this time. Yeah. The grindstone that grinds ragi bellowed two boys at once. After a meal of ragi balls, its top hair tuft goes around dancing. Riddle me this, said the girl. All at once, the air filled with the booming chime of the broom. There's something coiled up on land that's been plowed. What is it? Snake, ventured a lad. No, the plowing rope, took in Lakka. Why do you stick your nose in our game? Came back the boys at Lakka, cut to the quick. Yeah. Feeling deflated, Lakka stepped back a few paces. So did Boda, running at the mouth and lolling out its tongue. A knife under the asses of those who wouldn't get up. What is the meaning of this? Somebody threw up another riddle. A gale of giggles erupted. Women who were carrying home water in pails and pitchers from the well by the fort winked at one another before going off tittering, covering their mouths with their sarians. Okay, the next one is, I think it's, okay, you could do the frigging giggling later. Do riddle, demanded the boy. We don't know. You didn't get it. It's a spatula with which dosa is cooking on the griddle are flipped over. How? The ask is mystified. If the dosa cooking on the griddle doesn't come up, don't we place this under its bottom to turn it over? The spatula. I don't know that there are less complex words for spatula, but I should look for it. And Lakka nodded his, Lakka nodded his noddle in appreciation before moving on. Having taken a good kick on his belly, Buddha now tagged behind him at a respectful distance. A game of cards was in full swing inside the Mari shrine. People were seated in a circle, shuffling the cards and dealing with them with elegant ease. Someone was crooning in style. A milksop sissy. Silla doesn't a wife want? Why doesn't Silla a wife want? Only Shiva knows. I don't. Oh, I think we come to the end of it. So I wish you happy translation for a happy life. Google this number. As the introducer said, a volume of my articles has been published in Germany this month in November, and there are some articles on everything under the sun: language, letters, ELT translation, machine translation, linguistic software, etc. And this is my website. It's a bit waffly, as I said, but you can have a look at it if you want. But this, if there's anything you can do about it, you can Google and see. And then if somebody wants desperately, I can send a PDF. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah. So,
The
but
what
the
is the
word has
question?
to be understood within the context of utterance. If the context is not understood, how do we understand the word?
The immediate the reaction is that there are words which mean what they mean without a context.
Yeah.
Words can mean what they mean without a context.
Yeah. Okay.
Supposing whatever word you take, what there the noob said, you don't need a context there, right? You don't need a context. That is again a fallacy.
Okay. Suppose let's say, like you said, layered up. So in the first sense, okay, it has a direct meaning from the sentence itself. Like I get, it means what it means. Then the added layers to it within meaning itself, not going outside meaning, like alliteration or something, but within meaning itself. If there is something added to it, how do I open it up for my understanding?
No. Can you give me one example from any language? Tamil has an example. You might know Tamil, and let me know the example. Let's see how it's out. Let's be serious, and it's not. You have an example?
No, but I'm trying to understand her question there.
Okay.
If the context is not understood, how do we understand the word? So one level, of course, without the context,
No. That's not. No. Okay, Vincent. That's not fully true. I went to Bangalore. You need a context to understand it. What do you mean? I went to Bangalore. I went to Chennai. You need a context. What context? You tell me. I am Giridhar. What context? It is raining outside. What context? I am hungry. What context? People
hungry for what? Hungry for what? Hungry could mean, the word hunger can mean so many different things. Is it an anatomical or physiological hunger? Or is it an emotional hunger? Or is it a spiritual hunger?
In default case, it means only one thing, for food. Case, it means only one thing, for food.
Yeah.
So we are talking metaphorically, yes, there is a dialogue between a man and a woman, etc. Then he said, I'm not talking about this hunger, I'm talking about some other hunger. Then you have a context.
Yeah.
So, but to say that every linguistic context is not right. That is not right. And then I went to Chennai. Give me what context do you need? I went to Chennai. What context do you need? Stalin is the chief minister of Chennai, of Tamil Nadu. What context? What context? You tell me.
If it is that simple, it is fine. But then when there are layers of meaning, then you need a context to understand what exactly is the meaning of that particular word. But if it is as simple as Stalin is the chief minister of Chennai, I don't really need a context. There need not be a context.
No, but you agree. You agree that there are sentences where you don't take request to the context to make figure it out, right?
I agree. There need not be a context.
One has to agree there and then come to sentences where you need the context to figure it out. So we need to look at those contexts, like hunger. Yeah, metaphorically, I am hunger for sensual hunger, whatever, or hunger for love.
No,
but my observation is that people tend to make such statements which seem very impressive, but if you, as linguists, we need to go deeper. Okay. But I hope
because also in the also, sir, in language classes, we emphasize on contextualized meanings and language with a purpose. Raised within the context. So I'm having a problem with that. When you say it is a fallacy, I'm suddenly having a problem. I'm a little intrigued about that statement that it is a fallacy. Because language, when we teach language, we keep talking about contextualized meanings.
No, right. But that is not that is not a blanket statement about language, right? That cannot be a blanket statement about all language. So that is what that is my submission.
Okay.
It cannot be. I went to Chennai. What is the context? It is raining outside. What is the context to get its meaning? My hair is grey. What is the context? It's fashionable to say some things, but if you scrutinize them, no. I'm not saying that context is not important. I'm not saying. I am saying that it cannot be a blanket statement about language. It is. It's
In the
not.
sense that when I say I'm grey, do I just mean the age?
I am grey. My hair is grey.
Other context?
If hair is grey, what is the context?
No, other than grayness, like I may mean it to be my,
Yeah,
scholarly
it could also mean when I say my hair is gray, it could also mean I'm unpretentious
That's all.
or I'm old
Yeah.
I am
or
unpretentious.
I'm aging. I'm aging.
Aging.
Okay. No. Right. No.
So what
No,
exactly do you mean?
Only one.
What exactly do you mean when you say my hair is gray? Are you saying that you're unpretentious or are you saying that you're aging? So that is the context that I want.
That it cannot be a blanket statement. Number one, and number two, by default, you don't need a context. When you need a context, it's a marked instance. Exactly.
Pardon, sir, I didn't hear that. I didn't get that.
You need a context to figure out that is a marked instance. By default, my hair is gray. Anybody can understand. So there's some politicians take recourse to this. They say something which means only that. They say no, it was taken out of context. Means what? I know. One of my Kannada books, I have given instances. He says something which is very clear, and then he is saying, it was taken out of context. I don't mean to hurt sentiments, etc.
So politicians always have an alibi.
No, so what is your answer?
Clear, I hope.
So what is your answer when the context is at the, when the context plays the role to determine the meaning? That I'm not aging, but I'm saying something else, right? By saying that I'm gray, I'm turning gray.
Okay. No. One extreme instance of what you mean is what is called ethnography of speaking. You see, when I say one instance of ethnography of speaking is when I suppose I'm with my friend, then I'm about to leave. Then I say Nan Battini, which literally means I'll come. But I'm not coming, I'm going. Yeah. So it is a redone meaning of produced by the grammar. It is not the meaning produced by the grammar. It is meaning produced by social context. Yeah. That is called ethnography of speaking. We're not denying that. Not at all.
Yeah. Okay.
So in that context of leave taking, Nanu Bartini means I'm going. Actually.
Yeah, in
not
Tamil
I'm
also
coming. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
They can no. They can. We can. I'd like to. Serious. There are serious objections and feedback like this. I would love to react to them. Maybe on wherever. Even when you go back to Chennai, we can correspond or whatever. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Definitely, sir. Thank you.